everyone, and welcome to another of our interviews. And today I've got the pleasure of introducing, though many of you will know her already, Elizabeth Trotter, who is well known for contributing and also editing the Life Overseas communal blog. Is that what you call it? Collective blog?
Yeah, collective blog.
Do please welcome Elizabeth.
Thank you so much for having me.
And then I also just want to say, well, let me say a little bit about Elizabeth first. She and her husband have served in Cambodia, and they're now back in the US, but they're very much involved in helping people to thrive and do well on the field wherever God has placed them. So that, in that sense, they really share our heart. And I also wanted to say before we get started, this is one of a series of interviews. So if you want to go on our website and check those out, you can find them on www.FieldPartner.org. And I'm sure we'll be sharing lots of other resources as well, where you can come across Elizabeth in more detail. Okay, so Elizabeth, thank you so much I know you have a lot on your plate, so really grateful that you've taken time to be with us today. So Elizabeth, let's start with at the very beginning with your roots, where you came from and how you came to faith and all that kind of stuff. Okay.
Yeah, sure. Well, I was born into a military family. So I was actually born in Fort Knox, Kentucky. And then when I was a baby, we moved to West Germany. So it was still West Germany at the time. The Berlin Wall was still up. And I was there until I was about 5. And then we came back to the United States. So I'm actually a third culture kid myself. My family stayed in the Army until I was in junior high, and then we entered civilian life. And civilian life was quite the culture shock for all of us, I think.
I bet.
Yeah. And then regarding my faith journey, I think a lot of it has to do with, my parents taking me to church as a child. And then there was a big influence on my faith from going to Bible camps and church camps, and that always drew me closer to God, taught me to love worshiping God through song, and just taught me about Him. And I believe that was a big part of my faith journey.
Okay, that's great. To have all those influences on your life when you were that young. That's great. And then where did you meet your husband, and how did the romance blossom and all that?
So we were high school sweethearts. We met in high school at church. His family had been at this church his whole life, or nearly his whole life, and my family had just started going. So in Bible class, I don't remember what he said, but he said something, and I thought it sounded so wise. So I was smitten pretty fast. But we quickly became friends because we were interested in the same types of things, the same music and the same books and the same ideas. So we stayed friends throughout high school. And then in our senior year, we started dating, although at the time we called it courting. And then about a year later, we got married. So we got married in the year 2000. And
wow, how old are you then?
I was 18. So I was really young.
That's when I met my husband, but I had to wait for another 6.5 years before we actually got married.
To get married.
Wow.
Yeah, we were really young. And then we were young when we had children as well. So I was 22 when we had our first. We have 4 kids. We have 2 boys and 2 girls, and our oldest is off at college just this year. He's a freshman. And then my next is 16, so he's in 11th grade. And then I've got 2 girls, ages 12 and 13, but we're about to have birthdays in our family. So they're actually 2 years apart. So yeah, I homeschool them all and have from the beginning.
Wow. Okay, well, we'll come on to that because first of all, let's talk about your original call to missions. I mean, how did you land up in Cambodia? Was that after you both had careers, or you were mothering, weren't you? You were at home, but
yes, I was.
How about your husband? Was he? Was that out of a clear blue sky that you felt a call to go to Cambodia, or what?
Well, it felt like it at the time, but my husband had always wanted to be in missions. He was interested in missionary aviation as a child. He
Wow.
read Jungle Pilot and the stories of Nate Saint. And so he'd always wanted to do that, but we got married really young. So we kind of shelved that. And I do not think I was interested in that. I was just interested in being in love. Um, and in the meantime, when we were newly married, we got involved in youth ministry and really just fell in love with youth ministry. So we did it on a volunteer basis. And eventually, he took a paid position at a church. So we were doing that. And then he also had a nursing degree. So he was working in an emergency department in an urban hospital, and he was watching people die. And this
Mm.
really shook him. I still remember the first time he came home and had seen someone die, and it stayed with him all weekend. It had happened on a Friday, and it
Mm.
bothered him all weekend. So he was seeing this on a regular basis, and it changed him, kind of re-inspired him to want to do mission work again. And so, and he kind of sprang this on me one time when I was
As they
newly
do.
postpartum, sitting nursing the baby. I have complicated births, and I knew I wanted to have another baby because that was our third. And he just said, "I want to go into missions." And I was just sitting there nursing my baby, and I thought, but I want to have another baby, and I didn't want to do that in a developing country. So I kind of freaked out. Um, New information, it takes a long time for me to process. So I'm not super great with transitions anyway, and we'll talk about transition, I think, later on when we talk
Yeah.
about COVID.
Yeah.
Um, but I totally freaked out. Now, some of that was because I had some legitimate concerns about giving birth in another country, and I'm glad that I was able to have my fourth baby in America. It was extremely complicated birth and postpartum. So I was very thankful to be able to give birth in America before we moved overseas. And some of it was misunderstanding what missions is really like. I thought everybody lived in a jungle, and I didn't want to live in a jungle and lug my own water and my own firewood and all that sort of stuff. So some of it just took more education
Right.
to understand that there's plenty of missionaries who live in cities,
Mhm.
or even if you live in a village, you can have some better technology than what I was envisioning. And then some of it was just fear, just I was just afraid. And so I had to work through a lot of that. So it took us about 18 months. There were ups and downs and thinking I was okay and then not being okay. And it was very confusing, I think, for my husband because I would think I was okay. Yes, we can go. And then I would pull back and be so scared and say, no, we can't. So it was about 18 months. But then at the end of that, we had some experiences of prayer with our elders at church and just on our own that I really finally felt called to go. And he was also willing to stay at that point, but then we decided to go. So
Actually,
yeah, that's
that's
how we
important, isn't
evolved.
it? Both to be willing to go, well, however God leads, but to have that willingness both ways,
Yes.
really important.
Yeah.
So that you
Mhm.
can go with one heart and know that whatever you're facing together. It's great. Mm.
Right. And I knew going in, it was like I had to give up this idea that it was his idea and oh, if something went wrong, I could blame him because we really did go together.
Right. That's great. And so what did he go to do? Or what did you both go to do?
Yeah, well, I had my kids already, and so we were planning that I would stay with them and homeschool them for most of the time. He went to do church planting work with our organization,
Mm-hmm.
and we decided on Cambodia because the agency kind of suggested that we look into it. So when we applied with the agency, we said we don't know where in the world, don't have a call to a specific place. And they suggested Cambodia because my husband's dad had wanted to go to Cambodia. He was a dentist, he wanted to be a medical missionary.
Well,
Um, but he got cancer and died before he was able to go. And so they just said, well, to kind of continue this his legacy, uh, perhaps you could look into Cambodia, not to lock us in, but just to consider. And so we took a trip. He took a trip first, and then because I was pregnant with our fourth, So he took the trip first, and then later I was able to take a trip with him, and we just fell in love. So we said, okay, we'll do Cambodia.
Right.
Um, and church planting was the focus because that's the focus of the agency. Um, but then, I don't know, probably the first year we were there, my husband was praying. He was at a conference and they were leading him in prayer, and he was asking God about his ministry and what it would look like in Cambodia. And he felt like God told him, your ministry is going to have two pillars, um, a ministry to young people, which we had already done youth ministry, but young people is not just youth ministry, it also extends into people in their 20s. So he was thinking that, and then also heart focused counseling and pastoral care. And he didn't have any training in that, but we had received some really helpful pastoral care before we left. Um, and so that kind of surprised him because he was thinking just straight up church planting. And so that kind of shifted what he was doing, and he got extra training and different things. And so that's what he ended up doing. It went through, several iterations of different types of training. And then he was doing that in Cambodia until COVID hit. And
Right.
it was easy to translate that to something more worldwide with member care because everyone was going to Zoom.
Right. Indeed. So the agency was fine with that switch in focus for him?
Yes, and the member care team was really happy to have him
I
actually
bet. I
because
bet.
there weren't any men on the member care team at that time. So
Mhm.
they were happy to approve that request.
Great, great. So preparing to go, did you, what kind of pre-field training did you get? Cross-cultural training in particular, and orientation as well. Did you get orientation to the Khmer culture and all that?
Yeah, so our agency first had us do their 2-week orientation and a 1-week course called Kairos. I don't
Great.
know if you've heard of
Oh, absolutely.
perspectives
Mm,
and Kairos. Yeah, so Kairos is like the abbreviated version of this long 9-month course called Perspectives. It's a worldview course. So we took that, and that was really life changing. Kind of just shifted the way we looked at the Bible and God's heart for all people. So even though we wanted to go into missions, I think we still needed that help, just seeing the fingerprints all over scripture.
mm.
And then we were required to take 5 weeks of training at MTI, which is in Colorado in the United States. It's called Mission Training International.
Very good.
So they had cultural training and language training acquisition. Uh, and that was really helpful. So it taught us about transition and goodbyes and culture shock and paradox and what we call the yay ducks and the yuck ducks, which is all the good things that happen at the same time as the bad things, and learning to just accept that they're kind of coming at the same time. So that was really helpful language for when we actually did transition and to help your kids have a language for it. And also
Okay.
the language training part itself was really helpful because we learned the different consonants that different languages have that English doesn't. So it really helped me when I moved and started Khmer language learning to kind of grasp certain consonants that I might not have otherwise. So,
What you mean, the phonetics, the how you make the
yeah,
sound?
yeah. Like whether it's vocalized or I think it's voiced and non-voiced,
Yeah.
where you're putting kind of a lot of breath into the consonant or not. And Khmer has both. So it was good for me to, yeah, learn the
Good.
difference.
I know an awful lot of people don't get that, so that's really, really useful. Excellent. So then you lived in Cambodia for 9 years, is that
It
right?
was about 8 years.
8 years. Okay. So what were some of the highlights and what were the lowlights?
Well, I think when I think about Cambodia, I think it was this place to meet God for me. There were so many things I learned about God and about myself um, during that time there. So it's this kind of special 8 years in my mind with that. But specifically, um, letting God um, he kind of showed me my voice and my skills, things that I didn't really know before. And that prepared me for this transition back to America, where I can use those skills in editing.
Mhm.
Um, and I think, too, when we look back, our international community was a huge highlight. So we were part of an international church. There were between 30 and 40 nations worshiping there every Sunday. And the worship was good, and the teaching was good, and the fellowship was good. And so much of the content that ended up in our book, Serving Well, was really born at that international church. Something that I was learning uh, from the teaching, something how I prayed during the worship time. There was usually a lot of space given to pray during worship time, or conversations I had with other people. And so I didn't realize it at the time that we were putting the book together, but later we had copies of the book, and I looked around at this room where all these experiences happened, where I met God so many times, and I thought this book was born in this room.
Wow.
So that was definitely a highlight.
Mm.
And then my kids, third culture kids, missionary kids, they were part of a homeschool co-op. And so that was really good because they were able to form friendships with other third culture kids, who it's kind of like third culture kids really get other third culture kids in a way that sometimes if you're not both third culture kids, you don't get each other.
It's truly, really true. Right. So then let's talk about the homeschooling. What drew you in that direction? Because you said you were doing it even before you went. So what drew you to homeschooling as the way you wanted to go with educating your kids?
Well, I was a reluctant homeschooler, just like I was a reluctant missionary. It was my husband's idea, and he was homeschooled. He thought it was a good experience. I was public schooled. I thought it was a good experience. So I just really didn't have an idea of what it was. I was afraid my children might bother me if I were with them all day long. I was afraid I didn't have the skills to do it. I was also afraid that I would kind of become engulfed in it, and just homeschooling was the only thing about me. And I didn't want all of my identity to sort of collapse onto that one thing. And so another mom, I don't even think she was a homeschooling mom, said, well, why don't you join a co-op? Meet other people who are homeschooling.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did. And I kind of interviewed all the moms, informally, just asked them so many questions. And I found out that homeschooling families do things very differently from each other. You can really do it the way you want to do it. And it doesn't have to take over your life. It's not the only thing about you. And so that kind of gave me the courage to try it. And
Mm-hmm.
then we decided we liked it.
That's
And
great.
then when it was time to go to Cambodia, um, we just wanted to continue doing that. We didn't have to transition to it because that can be
Mm.
hard if you're not
Right.
homeschooling and you need to switch when you move onto the field, because not everyone lives in a city where there's an international school. And the international schools can be somewhat expensive. So we were able to save money doing that, and it fit our family. So
Right. And presumably help the whole transition for them because it wouldn't have been that much different from what they were used to already. Mm.
right. And that is why we continued homeschooling when we came back from Cambodia, to keep everything as much the same as possible.
Right. Yeah. So, but I mean, I think you would agree that educating your kids on the field is about the biggest challenge that any family with kids has to face. And there are lots of different options. So, I mean, for us, I really struggled with it, but we landed up sending our kids to boarding school. And I'd also been sent to boarding school. So, and kind of the feeling of judgment on myself sometimes, and the unspoken judgments of others. So that's one option. But there were lots of things that were good about that for our kids. Lots of things also that weren't so great. But then there's also international school. There's local school, and there's sending your kids back to family at home. I mean, what would you recommend, or have you recommended to people when they've come to you asking about homeschooling, or what other possible way they could do it? I mean, I could not have homeschooled. I tried it for about 6 weeks and said, no, it's not me.
Well, first of all, I know that every family is different. So when someone comes to me asking for advice, all I'm going to say is, this is how we did homeschooling. These are some of the options for homeschooling. Every family does it differently. Um, but I know that it doesn't fit everyone. It's interesting that you say you received judgment for the boarding school option. I sometimes felt that with the homeschooling option
All
because we
right.
had a couple really good international schools in our city. And I could tell that some people thought that I should not be homeschooling and should be sending them to school. So I think that women in general,
We
we
compare
struggle with,
ourselves with each other and we
yes,
tend to get on our high horses.
right. So we can judge other people, but also we feel a lot of condemnation from other moms. But yeah, I think we just have to remember that we are all different and every family is different and every situation is different. So there aren't as many boarding schools now, but there are still a few. Um, and if you live in a city, I think an international school, whether it's a secular international school or it's a missionary kids school, is a good option. And we've known people who, they worked in the provinces and homeschooled when their kids were younger, and when their kids got into high school, they moved to the city so they could send their kids there. So that's one way some families do it. Um, some places, I think it's illegal to homeschool. So,
Oh, right.
so I think you can't in some European countries. So you need to send your kids to local schools in those places.
Right.
Um, and then some families do kind of a combination of their homeschooling, but they also want to send their kids to a local school, maybe part-time, so they can get the language there. So there's just a lot of options. I think Amy Medina talked about all the options on the Life Overseas blog, but you summarized them really well.
Well, at least the fact of the matter is that there's no blueprint. There's no sort of book in the sky that where everybody says, okay, well, that's what we're going to do now. You just have to really
Right.
hear from God, don't you? And
Yes.
then be
Yes,
willing to
exactly.
just trust him that he's got your kids
Hmm.
for their futures and whatever they're going to be
Hmm.
needing in the future. So that's good. Thank you. Nice to share that. I stumbled across A Life Overseas. I don't know how, but as soon as I did, I thought, wow, what a resource. Such honest writing, so on the ball for a lot of the issues that people are facing. So how did you get involved in that? And then you took on the role of main editor, is that right?
Yes, and that was just a series of volunteer opportunities, a long series. So it was started, I think, in 2012 by two missionaries, Angie Washington and Laura Parker. And it was started as a collective blog. So many missionaries contributing to it. I don't think I really knew about it at the time. At some point, my husband had found out about it and he submitted a guest post. This was maybe late 2013. And they looked at our website and saw that we both were writing and asked us both to guest post. And then a few months later, invited us to write regularly. So we did that for several years. Um, Early on, I think I remember volunteering, hey, I can fix your typos and your commas. So just kind of offering to proofread. And they said, sure. And so I started doing that. And then a while later, when the two founders were both repatriating to their passport country, they needed someone to help run the site. And when I repatriated, I understood why, because it's a really big project to change cultures again. So I was like, oh, this is why. I totally understand what was going on. So at that point, Marilyn Gardner took over the lead editor, and she had been guest editing. She asked me to do that. So I did that for about a year. And then about a year later, Marilyn asked me, would you take over the lead editing job? And I said, okay. So that's what I've been doing since 2016. I've been kind of running the whole thing.
So you and Jonathan share very honestly about topics that many shy away from. Mental health issues, including eating disorders, Sexual pleasure and dysfunction in marriage, and politics in the church are some of the subjects that came to mind when I thought about that. And I just wondered, I mean, speaking as someone from the field, I really value people sharing honestly about, stuff. And so I'm always grateful when I come across, honest sharing from the heart. But I'm just wondering whether, people from home, loved ones, agency people, do people ever give you flack for the stuff that you share?
Well, I think
How
there's
do you
always a
handle it?
risk.
I do. Sorry.
There's always a risk, I think, when you share very vulnerably, that someone's going to reject you or judge you, or withdraw their support. Very early on, I started blogging just as a way to process culture shock. And so I was just being very honest. I'm not sure I know any other way to live. Um, so that was just kind of part of what we did. We spoke honestly. I remember those first few weeks in Cambodia were really bad, and I was very honest with our supporters about this is really bad and this is really hard. And they said back things like, well, you know what? Now when things are good, we're going to believe you because you were very honest about the bad. And I was like,
That's
okay.
brilliant.
um, but so I think that was always a part of our ministry, is just sharing honestly. When it comes to trickier conversations, in the past several years, I don't like conflict myself, so I don't post controversial things for myself. Um, I will only write publicly about something that I think is important, that is going to help someone else. And so I'm doing it from a posture of, I'm not doing it for me, for my platform, but I want other people to see that they're not alone in struggling with whatever they're struggling
Right.
with, and to give them hope. And I think my husband comes from that same posture. He has an added dimension to it where he sits with people, doing pastoral care and coaching, and he hears many heartbreaking stories. So when it comes to ways people have been wounded in the church, um, he has many stories in the back of his head. And when he shares about, abuse by church leaders, things like that, he's doing it for those people.
Mm.
And so, of course, yes, you can get some negative feedback publicly, especially from people you don't know. And that's the thing about sharing online, is people you
Mm.
don't know can interact with you. But the number of private messages that are positive and grateful greatly outweigh that. So I think that that's kind of where we're coming from. It's like, we are doing this for other people, even
Mm.
though, yes, sometimes feels risky.
Right. Well, I mean, I know, having raised 5 daughters, I know that eating disorders are a real issue for young girls, especially these days. I mean, not only girls.
Mm.
So I know. I wish that had been around. What you shared about your own story had been around when our kids were younger.
Mm.
But one of them was a model, and for a number of years in New York, and all that goes with that. She went through. She's come through amazingly well. But yeah, it needs talking about. It needs the willingness to just, especially when you've got a story where you've come through, so as you say, to give hope, to give this isn't something that's going to blight your life forever, or even for people looking on, that you're not going to have to support someone fighting that forever, if they really are willing to do the work. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you for sharing that.
So you weren't have been alone in facing the sudden reversal of what COVID brought into people's lives. So what led you to decide that you needed to leave at that point? And I did gather already that it was a tough return. So tell us how that went for you.
Sure. Yeah, so we had planned to have a furlough in 2020. That was always our plan. Um, we had a complicated visa and passport situation at the time, and that was not supposed to be a problem because we had solved it before on furloughs, getting our passports renewed and then getting visas. So our visas were month to month because our passports were about to expire, but we could still get to America and do it all there. That was our plan. And then COVID was a thing in Asia before it was a thing in America. So
Yeah.
we were watching it since January of 2020, and it didn't really become a thing in America till March. So our plan was to leave sometime in April, but as it just accelerated and spread more, we bumped up our trip to March. So we actually left and we flew through Taiwan. We were some of the last flights through Taiwan
Oh, did
in
you?
the middle of March. Everything was canceled. Thankfully, our flights didn't get canceled.
Wow. Tell me
Because
about it.
it was so strange. It was
Yeah.
like the world was literally shutting down, and we came through, and we were so glad that we got through. Our plan was to return 4 months later. It was supposed to be a 4 month furlough, and I just assumed that 4 months would be enough for this to pass through. I mean, I think I'd looked at models of, what we thought was going to happen. And I thought, surely it will be done, but it really wasn't done. This started to dawn on us a couple months in, because we couldn't get our passports renewed. And then the consulate was closed for getting visas. So there was just a very complicated situation. It was hard to get back in. You had to have a lot of negative COVID tests. You had to pay a lot of money for your quarantine. So we
Mm.
were looking at the details and just thinking, well, we knew we had an end date in Cambodia. It was 2022 because our son was going to graduate. And we had planned to kind of end our time there, at least for a year, help him get settled, and then reevaluate what we were doing, where we were going to serve in the world. And we just thought, how if we wait too long to go back, we won't really have a term of ministry. And so it felt very unfair at the time, but I also saw the details. I understood the situation. And so we made that very difficult decision.
Mm.
I was in a lot of emotional pain. I had a hard time in the beginning seeing that this was happening to missionaries all over the world,
Right.
because at the time I was just so focused on my own loss of the life we had over there, and the dreams we had. But over time, I was able to realize that this happened to so many people. They got locked out of their countries, they got stuck in their countries, or they were stuck in their houses during stay-at-home orders and they couldn't do ministry in the same way they had done before. So it really affected missionaries all over the world in some way or another. I don't think there's anyone who wasn't affected.
Mm.
Um, so.
Yeah. With the whole COVID thing, my feeling is there are an awful lot of people who are still waiting for, what can we do now? So I mean, have you any suggestions for people who well, how did you get through it yourself? The whole, what do we do now question.
The shock of re-entry or the actual
Well,
decision making?
both actually. The
Okay.
shock of re-entry, as when it's an unplanned for re-entry, it's always
Yes.
harder. And
Yes.
then the issue of how you came through. Sorry?
As far as the decision making, I really feel like that's individual. And I think very early on in COVID, someone wrote on A Life Overseas, like, we just need to give everyone grace because everyone's situation is different. So some people will try to get back in, some people will stay, and some people will leave. And we just need to give everyone grace. They're doing the best they can. And so when it comes to decision making, that's about all I have for that. It's like it's very
Mm.
individual. You just have to try to discern it yourself. But if you are in the middle of an unplanned reentry, that was the situation I found myself in. And I did not know at the time. I think I found out later. Someone told me that it takes about 2 years to go through a reentry process. I cannot remember who told me that. I had already come through it. And I thought to myself, well, if I'd known that ahead of time, I wouldn't have felt so frustrated with myself, so frustrated at the situation. I would have given myself a lot more grace. It took me a full year to really accept what had happened. So I was in some form of denial. Not like I knew that this was my new life, but I wasn't happy about it. I just kept thinking, oh, if this had never happened, if COVID had never happened. I mean, so
Yes.
many people are asking that question, right? What would life have been like? Um, but I had three separate times where I really cried a lot, like day after day for like a month, for weeks on end. I remember June 2020 was shortly after we made the decision. I went on a lot of solo walks. I cried a lot. I woke up every morning crying. I would wake up, I would remember who I was and where I was, and I would just start crying. No matter how much I'd cried the day before, I would just start again. I'm sure my husband was worried about me, wondering when this would pass. And after about a month, I really thought I was fine. I was better. I had grieved it. But it did come back in October, November that year when we were trying to buy a house. And so there was a lot of grief and fear associated with that. I went on a lot of solo walks again. Um, Looking back now, I think there was probably a hormonal aspect to some of my grief. So I'm 41 now, so I was just about to turn 40. And your hormones start to shift as a woman when you head into your 40s. And I think that I was extra emotional. Of course, it is a very big transition to move countries and not be able to say goodbye in person. But I think that was an added layer to it. And then I cried again February 2021. And that time, I think I cried so hard and for so long that I got scared that I was never going to be okay. And that's when I reached out for help. So I had a contact of a person who did debriefing, and I reached out to her because I knew I needed help. And I was able to meet with her a few times, and that was enough to get me to our planned formal debriefing, which was in August. It was about a year after we had moved back, which is a good time to do a formal debriefing.
Right.
So that was very helpful. By that time, I had kind of settled in. I had started to make friends. We had settled into a local church. I had come to accept it all. So for me, it took me a whole year to accept, oh, I'm here. This is my life. And then probably 18 months, from beginning to end. So 6 more months to really learn to love my new life, the life God was building for me. Um, so now I do love it, but it would have been helpful to know earlier on that it's a long process. It's going to take longer than a year.
Right. Well, we're taking note because Ross and I are going to do our final transition back from Taiwan next year. He's turning 80 in April. So we've announced that we will leave, but this is planned for, and we're going to try and do our best to do what we've taught people about, building a raft and, doing all of that stuff. So, it's up to us to follow through on what we've been sharing. No, but when it gets thrust upon you like that, it must be extremely tough. I know my sister had she had a brain tumor, a benign one, but she literally from one day to the next had to go back to England and then wasn't able to return. She's been back a few times since, but that it was extremely hard because it was unplanned, and obviously the shocking in itself, to have that kind of thing thrust on you. So anyway,
yeah.
As well as sharing through blogs and podcasts, you've become authors. So, tell us a bit about the books you've written. I love the one, your hats one.
Oh, thank you. So we started blogging. Like I said earlier, I started blogging just as a way to process transition when we first moved there in 2012. And it seemed to resonate with people. So I just kind of kept doing it. About a year later, my husband started writing on the blog. And we have very different styles. And that was a point of tension for a while. And my impression of him being so much more popular and better loved than I was. I had a lot of work to do on who I was, whether God loves me. So that was a big point of tension for us for a while. And yes, then I did work through some of those things and I wrote about them. And after that, we were able to really work on writing together as a partnership, and we help each other. We read each other's work. We accept that we have very different styles, and we celebrate each other's wins. Um, so that was early on. But as far as the book goes, so he put together a compilation of several of the articles both of us had written into kind of a workbook, a slim little self-published workbook, and he called it A41 because that was kind of the focus, his life focus for about 2 decades now, and it stands for All for One, like all for God. And so our blog name, trotters41.com, it looks like the number 41, but it stands for one, like all for God. So he named it that. And then we had some friends who had contacts in the publishing world, and they said, you need to get this published by a publisher. And so they helped us get in touch with the publisher. And that's where Serving Well came from. So it has a short title and a long subtitle. It is Serving Well, Help for the Wannabe, Newbie, or Weary Cross-Cultural Christian Worker. So, and we worked on that together. He actually came up with the title and I came up with the subtitle and we put them together. So I think that published in 2019 was the official year it published. And then Hats, which is my musings on motherhood and womanhood and ministry, he self-published that. It was his Mother's Day gift to me in 2018. And he said he thought I had helped people and he wanted to put it together. And so that was his gift to me. And I give that out as gifts to young mothers a lot of times. So moms who come to me asking questions about homeschooling, I'll say there's a section in homeschooling on here. So just so they know they're not alone, because a lot of these issues are universal and they are timeless. And I think that's why so many years after we wrote the articles, people will still read the book and say, oh, I really related to this situation. And the situation is long past for me. And sometimes I will have forgotten about it. But it's real for them. It's like right there in the moment because we're all humans. We are all dealing with the same issues.
Right. So, well, I think we've probably come to the end of our time, but I just want to say, if people wanted to contact you, if anyone does want to do that, you can at least contact through our website because Elizabeth and Jonathan are very kindly partnering with us. So we've got a link to their family blog, their personal blog, Trotters for One, and a link to A Life Overseas, and also to some counselling links that you've put together. So if any of that, any of what Elizabeth has shared, you can go to the website and find those. But if they wanted to contact you personally, would there be any way of doing that? Or would you feel that you might get overwhelmed by too many?
No, sure. I would love to hear from people. So my husband and I are both on Facebook and most of our posts are public. So you can follow us there. I'm Elizabeth Trotter. He's Jonathan Trotter. He's also on Instagram. I think it's Trotters for One, which is the name of the blog, I think is also the Instagram. He doesn't do everything public there because it sometimes has photos of our children and we kind of try to keep those not public. But also you can find us online, trottersforone.com. And you can also email me. So I am emarietrotter@gmail.com. And he's trottersfor1@gmail.com. So yeah, we're always happy to hear from people by email.
That's lovely. Well, thanks so much for sharing. I mean, there's been a lot. There's so much, and it's always a joy to hear people's stories. Everyone, as you've said a number of times, everyone is unique. But what we do share of, especially the tough stuff on the field, I think it really it opens up the possibility for further conversation and for really dealing with personal things that that you might not necessarily find the help for anywhere else. So thank you very much for doing that, and thank you for giving us food for thought.
Thank you for having me. It has been a joy to get to know you.
Yeah, good. So anyway, that's it for today. Thanks very much for joining us. And if you've enjoyed this interview, then please share it and like us on Facebook if you go on there, and check out the Trotters. So do it on our member care page or in the ways that Elizabeth has already mentioned. And we'll put the links probably at the bottom of this talk so you can find it there. Okay, that's it then. Bye-bye and God bless.